June of 1944, Normandy. The Sherman tank did not glide up the French lane so much as grind its way forward, every rotation of its road wheels sending a gritty shudder through the hull. The narrow, sunken road, little more than 2 ruts carved between ancient hedgerows, amplified every sound. Rubber track pads slapped against churned earth, steel clattered. Dust drifted upward in lazy spirals, only to be punched aside by the tank's hot breath. Inside the turret, Sergeant Joe Kelleher braced his shoulder against the recoil guard as the Sherman lurched again. "Feels like we're driving on wagon wheels," he muttered. But underneath the complaint was something he would never guess. Those track pads gripping the Norman soil were born not in a munitions plant, but in the quiet rows of cornfields thousands of miles away. The smell hit him next, an odd burnt sweet odor mixed with the sharper tang of hot metal. That smell, sharp and rubbery, belonged to synthetic rubber, Buna-S, the miracle material that kept the U.S. Army rolling through Europe. Kelleher did not know that by D-Day, nearly 3/4 of all American military tires came from synthetic rubber, nor that its earliest building block had once sloshed through Midwestern fermenting vats as corn-based alcohol. He only knew his tank kept moving, and movement meant survival. The hedgerows pressed close on both sides, walls of green older than many nations. Their thick roots held the soil like armor, and each turn in the lane seemed designed to stop an armored column dead. The Sherman strained, track pads gripping, then slipping, then gripping again. The crew swayed with each jolt. Private First Class Lenny Ortiz, the driver, muttered a steady litany of curses at the French landscape. "Thought this stuff was supposed to last forever," he grumbled, glancing down at the track shoes. He imagined rubber plantations somewhere in the tropics, trees bleeding white sap into buckets, sailors hauling bales across oceans. He didn't know that such plantations had been lost years earlier, swallowed by the Japanese advance. He didn't know that the rubber under him had never seen a tree. If someone had explained to Ortiz that the rubber holding the Sherman together had begun as yellow kernels on an Iowa farm, he would have laughed. And yet here it was, corn-borne alcohol cracked into butadiene, blended with styrene, polymerized into Buna-S, then pressed and cured into track pads, tough enough to hold under 25 tons of tank. The crew had learned the smell of burning synthetic rubber the same way they learned the whistle of incoming mortar shells' hard experience. When a Sherman pivot turned too sharply on packed earth, the rubber smoked. When a tank convoy halted too long under the Norman sun, the pads released a faint, warm odor. And when the fighting turned close and the tanks smashed through farm walls or braced against anti-tank ditches, that same chemical smell hung in the air like a ghost of factories far from the front. Corporal Sam Dwyer, loader and part-time philosopher, wiped sweat from his forehead. "You ever think about what this stuff is made of?" he asked aloud. "No," Ortiz replied. "And I ain't starting now." But Dwyer kept going. "Oil, sure. Steel, sure. But rubber? Turns out half the time it ain't even rubber. My uncle told me they cook it up out of alcohol. Like bootlegger fuel. Stuff he used to run tractors on." Kelleher snorted. "Your uncle was a menace, not an engineer." Yet somewhere in that exchange lay a quiet truth of modern war. A battlefield was not just mud and blood. It was chemistry. It was logistics. It was the invisible math of industry stretched across oceans. A hedgerow lane in Normandy was about the last place one would expect to find the story of American synthetic rubber. But it was there in every foot of tread and every rotation of the tank's road wheels. Every inch forward was, backed by a continent's worth of factories, distilleries, chemists, and farmers. When Japan seized the rubber plantations of Southeast Asia in early 1942, the United States lost nearly all access to natural rubber. Without it, tanks would not move, trucks would not haul ammunition, aircraft tires would burst on takeoff. It was a strategic catastrophe, one the War Production Board answered with a nationwide mobilization unlike anything America had attempted before. Cornfields, those quiet seas of green, became part of the front line. Distilleries that once bottled drinking alcohol or industrial solvents were converted into round-the-clock war plants. Rail cars loaded with corn arrived daily. Out the other end came the lifeblood of the synthetic rubber program. Huge volumes of anhydrous ethyl alcohol. That alcohol traveled by train to butadiene plants dotted across the Midwest and Gulf Coast. There, under heat and pressure, it was transformed into butadiene, the essential ingredient that made Buna S strong enough to replace natural rubber. From there, tanker trucks and rail cars carried butadiene to polymerization plants, where teams of chemists and engineers coaxed it to combine with styrene into long, tough chains. Those chains became black slabs, sheets, and blocks of synthetic rubber destined for tank factories in Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. By the time those rubber blocks reached the assembly line, they were no longer corn in any recognizable form. But the Sherman tank climbing the French lane on that June afternoon owed part of its strength to those faraway fields. The crew inside the tank did not know that government scientists had spent sleepless nights calculating how many millions of gallons of alcohol America needed. They did not know that Congress had poured billions of wartime dollars into the synthetic rubber program. They did not know that chemists had argued over catalysts, polymerization temperatures, and reactor designs as urgently as any general planned a battle. They only knew the tank moved, and that was enough. Outside, the hedgerow lane widened slightly. The Sherman pushed onward, rubber pads flexing, gripping, surviving. In that moment, the crew saw only the village ahead and the German positions rumored to be waiting. They did not see the long industrial chain stretching behind them, one that began with corn ripening under a Midwestern sun and ended with synthetic rubber grinding into French earth. In war, every mile was a miracle. And on that day in June of 1944, the miracle smelled faintly of burning rubber and warm corn. The man who would quietly influence the fuel logistics of the Allied armies in 1944 did not wear a lab coat or hold a university chair. He wore denim overalls, smelled faintly of silo dust, and believed without a hint of irony that a farm was the best laboratory God ever built. His name was Edwin "Eddie" Markham, a corn farmer from central Iowa. And long before generals worried about fuel shortages in North Africa or France, Eddie had been tinkering with alcohol-gasoline mixtures in a drafty barn lit by a single hanging bulb. He did not call it research. He called it getting the tractor to run when nothing else will. By 1938, Eddie's farm was already known in 3 counties for odd smells drifting from its machine shed. Visitors often found him hunched over a copper still, adjusting valves he had welded from discarded cream separators. His neighbors thought he was distilling moonshine. In truth, he was boiling down corn mash into high-proof alcohol, not for drinking but for experimenting with fuel. Tractor engines of that era were temperamental beasts. They coughed on low-grade gasoline, balked in the winter, and choked on bad kerosene. Eddie suspected that something cleaner, hotter, and simpler might work better, something he could grow himself. Using trial and error, he began, blending alcohol with gasoline in small batches, testing each mixture on an old Farmall tractor whose red paint had long ago faded to a weary pink. Most blends failed spectacularly. Engines backfired, valves clattered, or the tractor simply refused to start. But every failure taught Eddie something. Alcohol burned cleaner than gasoline. It atomized more quickly in cold air. And with just the right stabilizing agents, what Eddie simply called my stew, it could be mixed with gasoline without separating. By 1941, the outbreak of war brought new urgency to the nation's fuel demands, and rumors of Eddie's experiments reached the local agricultural extension agent, who visited the farm and watched, amazed, as Eddie's old tractor started instantly on a freezing February morning. The agent wrote a brief report for the Iowa State College Chemistry Department. Farmer in Boone County producing stable motor fuel blend using farm-derived alcohol. Claims efficiency, equal to commercial gasoline. No one knew then that this modest report would ripple outward into the broader scientific community. Just as America faced its greatest industrial crisis, Japan's seizure of Southeast Asia and the loss of natural rubber, when the War Production Board formed the synthetic rubber program in 1942, They needed alcohol, vast amounts of it, to produce butadiene, the backbone of synthetic rubber. Distilleries across the Midwest were converted into alcohol factories, and chemists sought ways to stretch production, stabilize transport, and maximize yield. A handful of researchers at Iowa State remembered Eddie's strange fuel blend and contacted him for samples. Eddie obliged, without fully understanding the scale of what he was contributing to. He handed over a metal can labeled Batch 11, Good Mix. Inside was his best alcohol blend, stabilized with a farmyard concoction of compounds he could not name but could certainly replicate. Chemists at the newly expanded butadiene plant in Louisville were stunned. Eddie's blend evaporated at a consistent rate, resisted freezing, and stored better than many laboratory mixes. Most remarkable of all, it burned hot and clean, hot enough to serve as an emergency additive for military fuel stocks when supply lines faltered. The chemists refined Eddie's mixture, breaking it down to understand why it worked. They discovered that his stew contained naturally occurring fusel oils, trace minerals from his well water, and stabilizers created unintentionally by the heat of his still. It was crude science, but it worked. The War Production Board authorized a quiet test. In late 1942, a batch of tank engines at Fort Knox ran on standardized versions of Eddie's alcohol blend mixed with gasoline. The results surprised everyone. Engines started more easily in cold weather. The blend reduced knocking. Fuel consumption increased slightly, but reliability improved. Most importantly, the alcohol component could be produced quickly in the United States. No tankers, no shipping lanes, no risk of enemy submarines. Eddie heard nothing for nearly a year. Then, in early 1943, a plain envelope arrived from Washington. Enclosed was a letter thanking him for valuable informal contributions to ongoing industrial research, along with a voucher for reimbursement of test materials, totaling $25. Eddie laughed so hard he nearly fell off his porch chair. Meanwhile, the U.S. Army was adopting the blend in small but significant ways. Field depots in North Africa and later in Italy mixed standardized alcohol-gasoline blends for winter operations. Alcohol supplements kept engines running when fuel quality degraded. And in the synthetic rubber program, the true industrial miracle, massive quantities of alcohol flowed into the butadiene plants that fed the war machine. By D-Day, Eddie's cornfield experiments had become part of a national system. 3 out of every 4 U.S. Army tires were made from synthetic rubber whose origin included farm alcohol. Tens of thousands of tanks, trucks, jeeps and aircraft rolled on material partly born in Midwestern soil. Eddie never claimed credit. He never sought it. When neighbors praised the flood of wartime production, he simply said, "Well, good ideas grow in rows, same as corn." He would never know that Sherman tanks grinding through Norman hedgerows were moving literally and figuratively on the power of his ridiculous blend. His homemade fuel recipe, once the subject of small-town jokes, had quietly become a thread in the vast industrial tapestry that pushed the Allies across Europe. In the end, Eddie remained what he had always been, a farmer who understood that chemistry, like farming, was mostly patience, stubbornness, and the courage to try something that sounded foolish. The war would prove that sometimes foolish ideas saved armies. The first time Captain Harold Hal Brinley saw the drums marked AAF Special Blend, Alcohol Extended, he assumed someone in the Quartermaster Corps had made a clerical mistake. It was March of 1944, and Brinley, logistics officer for the 4th Armoured Division, had spent the better part of a year fighting the same enemy everywhere he went. Fuel. Not German tanks, not Luftwaffe strikes. Fuel. Tanks ate it. Trucks guzzled it. Half-tracks drank it like parched cattle. Every mile forward was measured not in maps but in gallons. A Sherman in heavy maneuver needed nearly 2 gallons per mile. A tank battalion in full movement could burn 12,000 gallons in a day. And in the wet European spring, when transport routes turned to soup and engines laboured harder, consumption only grew worse. So when the first drums of alcohol-extended gasoline arrived at the depot west of Carentan, Brinley felt suspicion coil in his gut. He leaned close, sniffed the bunghole, and recoiled. "Smells like a distillery hit a refinery," he muttered. Lieutenant Sam Carrow, his assistant, laughed. "Maybe that's because part of it is." Brinley frowned. "You're joking." "No, sir. Laboratory tested, War Production Board approved. Supposed to help stretch high-grade gasoline." Brinley had read the circular last month, but dismissed it as another bureaucratic experiment. But now the reality sat in front of him. Dozens of drums containing a pale, slightly sweet-smelling fuel blend something between conventional gasoline and high-proof alcohol. He tapped the side of a drum. "And we're supposed to run tanks on this?" Carrow nodded. "In mixed ratios. Command says it helps stabilize volatile stocks when cold sets in. Works better than straight low-octane." Brinley's skepticism warred with necessity. The spring build-up for Operation Cobra was already straining supply lines. Everything tanks, bulldozers, trucks, generators needed fuel. And the Germans were making things worse. The retreating Wehrmacht left booby traps near road junctions and artillery targeting choke points. Too often, the armoured divisions arrived at new staging grounds, only to find their fuel delayed by destroyed bridges or nighttime Luftwaffe raids. A blend that stretched the gasoline supply, if it worked, might mean the difference between stalling and advancing. Brinley authorized the first test at dawn. A Sherman from C Company rolled into the staging yard, its side armour still showing scars from the hedgerow fighting 18 days earlier. The crew looked unimpressed when told they would be the guinea pigs. "Sir," the driver asked, "this isn't going to turn the tank into a giant cocktail shaker, is it?" "Only one way to find out," Brinley replied. They drained the Sherman's remaining fuel, filled it with the alcohol-extended blend, and signalled the crew to start the engine. What happened surprised everyone. The engine turned over, once clean, sharp, confident, and immediately settled into a steady rumble. No coughing, no sputtering, no backfire. In the cold morning air, the Sherman idled as though fueled by premium stock. Brinley folded his arms. "Well, I'll be damned." A second test followed. Then a third. Trucks, half-tracks, and even a bulldozer ran on the blend without issue. In colder temperatures, the engines started faster than before. Warm-up time shortened, and though fuel consumption remained slightly higher, reliability improved. There was something different in the exhaust, too, a faint sweetness instead of the usual oily sting. Mechanics joked they were fighting a war powered by corn whiskey. By the end of the week, Brinley had authorized full integration of the blend into divisional operations. The results were undeniable. Vehicles stalled less often, engines fouled less frequently, spark plugs stayed cleaner. Carburetors, usually temperamental in cold, responded better than before. But the true impact only became clear during the first major movement of the division after the breakthrough at Saint-Lô. The 4th Armoured Division raced south in a maneuver later known as the Avranches Dash, a thrust so rapid that even Eisenhower later remarked on its audacity. In those days, roads jammed with vehicles. Dust clouds rose like ghost columns. The entire advance risked collapse if fuel trucks failed to keep pace. They didn't, and part of the reason was the alcohol-extended blend. Later analysis showed that mixing the alcohol blend with standard gasoline allowed quartermaster units to stretch their high-grade stocks by nearly 1/4 without sacrificing reliability. The alcohol component burned slightly cooler, reducing engine knock. On rough, hot days, it even kept a handful of vehicles from overheating. One night near Rennes, as Brinley reviewed consumption logs by lantern light, he realized the scale of what they had stumbled into. The blend didn't just extend gasoline, it extended momentum. His pen hesitated as the truth hit him. Without this fuel, they would not have made the dash. The next morning he reported the findings to higher headquarters. The response came quickly. Continue using the blend. Prioritize it for tanks, reconnaissance vehicles, and engineering equipment. Report further data weekly. The order was clear. The alcohol-extended blend was no longer an experiment. It was now strategy. Months later, Veterans of the division would credit many things for their successes: the grit of the tankers, the firepower of the Shermans, the leadership of Patton's command. But in the quiet corners of the logistics tents, officers like Brinley knew the truth. Wars were not only won by courage and steel. They were won by fuel, especially the kind borne from cornfields thousands of miles away. And on many long marches across France, as engines hummed smoothly under unfamiliar fuel, the men joked that the Midwest farmer behind all, this must be some kind of wizard. They weren't far off. The Allied armies rolling eastward in late summer of 1944 seemed unstoppable to outside observers. Newspapers printed maps showing great sweeping arrows cutting across France, Belgium, and into the Low Countries, tidy, confident strokes, suggesting inevitability. But inside the logistics tents, the story looked entirely different. Momentum was a fragile thing, measured in gallons, not glory. Every armoured thrust, every infantry advance, every artillery barrage depended on a river of fuel. Not a metaphorical river, but a literal one, an invisible artery of tank trucks, fuel depots, pumps, jerry cans, and hastily laid pipelines that stretched across liberated French countryside like veins under skin. And in the midst of this frantic energy, the alcohol-extended fuels, born from Eddie Markham's quiet farm experimentation, found their true battlefield purpose. Major Evelyn Porter, one of the few female petroleum officers assigned to the European theatre of operations, had been warning headquarters for weeks. "We are chasing our own tail. If we outrun our supply chain, our tanks will stop moving regardless of what the Germans do." The reply she received was polite but firm. Keep the fuel flowing. So she did. Porter operated from a temporary supply hub near Chartres, where tanker trucks queued in long, dusty lines like thirsty cattle. Her days were measured in convoys, pump failures, flow rates, and the ever-present fear that one German fighter bomber might swoop in and ignite the whole depot. But her greatest challenge was not German resistance, it was geography. France was enormous, its roads narrow, its bridges weak. Truck convoys crawled forward at a pace far too slow for Patton's army, which devoured gasoline faster than the Quartermaster Corps could replace it. The Red Ball Express strained to keep up, its drivers pushing themselves through day-long hauls with no rest and little margin for error. By early September, fuel shortages threatened to halt the Allied advance entirely, and Porter found herself staring at maps covered in red circles, places where tankers had broken down, where drivers had missed turns, where depots had run dry. That was when she proposed something bold. "Use the alcohol-extended blend as the stabilizing carrier stock," she said to her commanding officer. "We can push lighter pipeline sections forward faster if the fuel's volatility is controlled. The alcohol reduces vapor lock. It compensates for impurities." Her CO blinked. "You want to use that farm fuel in the main line?" "Yes, sir," she said. "We're already using it in frontline vehicles. Now I want to use it to move the gasoline that feeds them." Command hesitated. Then desperation made the decision for them. Within 48 hours, Porter led a mixed team of American engineers and British pipeline specialists to an open field near Dreux. They unloaded reels of lightweight, collapsible pipe sections that could be laid by hand, hammered together, and buried shallowly beneath hedgerows. This improvised pipeline would later be overshadowed by Operation Pluto, the great undersea pipeline from Britain to France. But this land-based artery, assembled in haste by grease-stained engineers under relentless deadlines, was the one that kept the armoured divisions moving in September of 1944. The alcohol-extended blend played a quiet but crucial role. Traditional high-octane gasoline was finicky in field pipelines. It vaporized quickly, fouled pumps, and suffered pressure losses over long distances. But the alcohol component in the blend stabilized the fuel during pumping. It reduced vapor lock, the bane of field pipelines, created smoother pressure curves, and allowed smaller pumps to operate at higher efficiency. Porter watched as the first batches flowed through the gauges. The needles danced, fluctuating briefly before settling. Pressure held. Flow was steady. She let out a slow breath. "It'll work," she murmured. The first delivery reached the forward depot near Rambouillet, just as an armoured column was preparing to halt for lack of fuel. Drivers pulled the caps off waiting trucks. Clear, faintly sweet fuel splashed into thirsty tanks. Engines roared to life. The advance resumed. Word spread quietly through logistics channels. Porter's line is working. Engineers extended it further each week, snaking it under farm roads, across shallow rivers, and through orchard rows. French villagers, curious and helpful, offered tools, wagons, and willing hands. The pipeline grew 50 miles, then 70, then nearly 100. Every new segment meant fewer trucks on the road, fewer breakdowns, fewer opportunities for German aircraft to strike convoys. It meant tanks reached the Siegfried Line with more fuel than planners believed possible. One evening near Soissons, Porter stood beside her pipeline, crew as the sun dipped behind the trees. She watched engineers unload new sections of pipe, their hands black with grease, their eyes tired but determined. Lieutenant Mark Tooley approached her, wiping sweat from his brow. "Ma'am, headquarters wants to know how we're moving fuel this fast." "Tell them we built a river," Porter replied. "And we taught it to flow uphill." Tooley grinned. "And the alcohol?" She shook her head with a small smile. "Tell them some farmer in Iowa figured it out before the chemists did." The lieutenant laughed. "I'll leave that out of the official report." But the truth remained. The alcohol extended blend, dismissed by many as a stopgap, had become the silent enabler of the Allied logistical miracle. By October, German officers interrogated after capture asked the same question again and again. "How do your tanks keep moving? Our reconnaissance shows you should have run out of fuel weeks ago." No one ever told them about the invisible pipeline running beneath French soil. And certainly, no one told them about Eddie Markham's old copper still in Iowa. War, after all, often turned on secrets so humble that they were almost unbelievable. By late October of 1944, the Allied advance had slowed to something between a crawl and a shudder. Rain hammered the Ardennes, the roads dissolved into mud, vehicles bogged down axle deep, engines laboured like dying beasts. And everywhere across the forested hills, the smell of damp earth mingled with the unmistakable scent of strained machinery. Fuel shortages had stalked the armies for months, but in the cold, the problem became something else, something more insidious. Low temperatures thickened gasoline, carburetors iced, engines refused to start. Trucks that had run perfectly in August now took half an hour of coaxing just to cough awake. Even Sherman tanks, normally stalwart, sputtered like old tractors abandoned in a barn. Yet, across certain units, of the First and Third Armies, something strange began to happen. Vehicles fueled with the alcohol extended blend, still considered experimental by many, behaved differently. They woke more easily in the morning cold. Their engine knock diminished, and while they still struggled against the mud, their powertrains complained less. At first, no one noticed until the morning of November 2nd, on a frozen ridgeline outside of Monschau. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Dalton, commanding the motor pool for the 106th Infantry Division, stood in a grey dawn thicker than steel wool. Frost clung to vehicle hoods. Drivers stomped their feet and rubbed their hands together. The forest beyond looked like a wall of smoke-coloured spears. "Coldest morning yet," Dalton muttered. "Let's see what starts." Calling roll for engines was a grim ritual. The drivers climbed into their trucks. One by one they hit the starters. The first two trucks running standard fuel groaned and died. A third caught, sputtered, and stalled. The fourth refused to turn over at all. Dalton winced. "We'll be here all day." But then came the trucks fueled with the alcohol extended blend. The first started instantly clean, sharp, confident. So did the second. The third hesitated for only a moment before settling into a steady idle. Dalton blinked. "What in God's name?" A mechanic grinned. "Heard it from the tank boys. That farm fuel likes the cold." Dalton rubbed his chin. He had read the same technical bulletin Brinley once dismissed. Blends may reduce vapor lock, improve cold starts, and maintain stability across temperature swings. But reading a paper in a tent and watching a line of trucks fire up in freezing air were two very different things. "Get the rest of the drums out," Dalton ordered. "Starting today, anything with wheels runs on the blend." Word spread quickly, travelling through motor pools, quartermaster tents, and field kitchens. Soldiers, who normally cursed their vehicles in cold weather, began asking quietly, "You got any of that sweet-smelling stuff?" The alcohol mix was still only a fraction of total fuel stocks, but the impact multiplied wherever it was used. Winter exposed a truth no one had expected. Corn-derived alcohol was naturally resistant to the very problems that crippled engines in the cold. It vaporized faster. It mixed evenly. It prevented carburetor icing. And at a time when every convoy, every tank company, every resupply column was fighting both terrain and temperature, those advantages mattered more than anyone realized. By mid-November, the First Army reported something unprecedented. The units using the alcohol-extended blend had lower vehicle attrition rates than those relying entirely on standard gasoline. Mechanics filed reports showing fewer cracked fuel lines, fewer clogged carburetors, and fewer frozen pumps. In Luxembourg, Sergeant Abel Moritz, an armored recovery specialist, wrote in his log, "The tanks running that mixture start easier. They idle smoother, even in sleet, even when the fuel trucks freeze. I don't know what's in that blend, but whoever made it deserves a medal." Little did he know the man responsible was mending fences and feeding cattle a continent away, completely unaware that his tinkering had become a quiet weapon of war. In the first week of December, as American units unknowingly braced for the German counterattack that would become the Battle of the Bulge, winter tightened its grip. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Snow dusted the forest floor. Vehicles left tracks like scars across the frost. And again, the alcohol-extended blend proved itself. In the dark woodland near Street, Vith, an entire tank battalion faced disaster when a cold snap froze the main gasoline stocks. Fuel trucks arrived with drums so cold the contents sloshed like half-set jelly. Mechanics brought blowtorches to warm them. Time bled away. But in the auxiliary depot beside the command post, barrels of alcohol-extended blend remained fluid, thin, pourable, alive. Tank crews rolled their Shermans forward and began refueling from those drums. Engines came to life. Tracks bit into ice. Within an hour, the battalion was moving. A day later, when German forces struck, those same Shermans were the ones that held the line. Historians would later argue over maps and strategy, over divisions and commanders. But for the men on the ground, the truth was simpler. Engines that start are engines that fight. At the end of December, as the tide of the Bulge turned and the Allies forced the Germans back, Lieutenant Colonel Dalton wrote a final winter report. Without the alcohol-extended blends, we would have lost mobility in the cold. Our tanks would not have reached the line in time. Our trucks would not have moved ammunition. Our recovery vehicles would not have pulled the wrecks out. Whatever its origin, whatever its chemistry, the blend works. It kept us moving when nothing else did. And in a war defined by movement, by the ceaseless grind of machinery, advancing mile by mile, that was all that mattered. By January of 1945, the European theatre of operations had become a frenzy of movement, repair, and reorganization. The Battle of the Bulge had nearly torn the Allied front apart, and the armies that emerged from that crucible carried with them a brutal lesson. Winter, mud, and distance could cripple even the mightiest mechanized force. In the headquarters at Verdun, fuel officers scribbled furiously across maps. Arrows denoting future offensives stabbed toward the Rhine. Circles marked depots that needed reinforcing. Lines indicating supply corridors grew thicker with every planning session. But tucked into one corner of the Petroleum Division's planning board was a single annotation in neat handwriting. Continue using the agricultural alcohol blend. Yield stable. Field results exceptional. Recommend. Expansion. The note might have gone unnoticed, another logistical footnote amidst a war of millions, if not for one persistent major. Major Evelyn Porter, recently reassigned from field operations to the analysis section, arrived in Verdun carrying a stack of motor pool logs thick enough to stop a rifle bullet. She dropped them onto Lieutenant Colonel Brinley's desk with a heavy thud. Brinley looked up. "You again." "You're welcome," Porter said, "for keeping your tanks moving last month." Brinley smirked. "If you're here to argue that we should expand the blend program, you're preaching to the converted." "I've seen what it does." "Then help me prove it," Porter replied. "Because higher headquarters thinks we're exaggerating." She opened the top binder. Rows of columns showed cold start times, fuel line failures, vapor lock incidents, and engine stall rates. Units using the alcohol extended blend consistently outperformed those using standard stocks. Brinley whistled softly. "That's not small." "No, sir," Porter said. "It isn't." Together they compiled a report for the Theatre Petroleum Committee. It contained no tactical glamour, no roaring tanks or dramatic river crossings. Just numbers, endless, undeniable numbers. Engine availability up 20%. Cold start reliability up nearly 40%. Fuel spoilage down. Pipeline flow improved. And at the very end, in the acknowledgements, one line, blend based on farm-derived alcohol formulation originating in U.S. Agricultural sector, Iowa. The committee approved expanded production. More distilleries were converted. More alcohol flowed from the Midwest. More drums arrived at depots across France and Belgium. But far from the war, the man whose tinkering had shaped these decisions stood in his barn with his sleeves rolled up because a valve had jammed again. Eddie Cornfield, chemist. Markham had no idea his fuel experiments were being copied, tested, refined, and distributed across an ocean. He did not know that his blend had kept tanks moving during the worst winter storm in decades. He did not know that pipeline engineers quietly praised the stability of the Iowa additive. He only knew one thing. The war had taken his best farmhands, and he needed fuel that worked whether the weather cooperated or not. His wife, Clara, stepped into the barn doorway, hands on her hips. "You're going to freeze to death in here," Eddie grunted as he tightened a bolt. "Not if I get this coil to behave." "You could have been a chemist," she said. "A real one." He laughed a warm, rolling sound. "And miss all this?" Clara shook her head, smiled, and went back toward the house. Outside, the fields lay dormant beneath a sheet of snow. Stark and still. It was quiet in a way that wartime Europe never could be. Eddie didn't know that while his land slept, his ideas were marching through France like an invisible army. Back at Verdun, Brinley and Porter received another set of field reports, this time from Patton's Third Army. The data stunned them both. Not only had units using the alcohol blend maintained mobility, but their maintenance crews filed significantly fewer emergency requests. A column near Saarlautern reported reducing fuel-related breakdowns by nearly half. Engineering battalions digging tank traps found their generators ran longer and started easier. Armored cavalry screens constantly pivoting along icy roads reported that the blend reduced stalling on hills. "It's not just stopping problems," Porter whispered. "It's preventing them." Brinley leaned back, rubbing his eyes. "Do you realize what this means? This could change fuel logistics for the rest of the war." Porter nodded slowly. "It already has." By early February, the alcohol extended blend was no longer an experiment. It was doctrine. A quiet regulation slipped into the quartermaster. Manuals. Mix agricultural distilled alcohol into designated fuel stocks at approved ratios to ensure stability under extreme weather conditions. Yet even with expanding use, anonymity clung to its origins. In a war of titanic production, aircraft carriers, Liberty ships, and Sherman factories earned headlines. No newspaper praised a farmer's still. No war correspondent wrote about fuel blends. But the frontline soldiers knew something had changed. In a freezing forest near Prüm, a tank crew joked that the fuel tasted like corn whiskey if you got close enough. In a motor pool outside Bastogne, mechanics referred to it as the warm blood mix. In Patton's supply trains, drivers called it Iowa firewater. Names changed. Results did not. One evening in late February, Porter received a classified memo. She read it twice, her eyebrows rising. Then she carried it to Brinley. He looked at the header. Office of the Petroleum Advisor, Shave. You've caught someone's attention, he said. Porter tapped the paper. They want a summary of the blend's origins, a full technical lineage. Brinley frowned. Do they know? She shook her head. Not yet. But they're about to. For a long moment, the two officers sat in silence, surrounded by maps and reports. Write it, Brinley said finally. Tell them the truth. And so Porter wrote it plain, direct, unadorned. She described the corn farmer, the copper still, the crude but brilliant experiments, the sample can labelled Batch 11, Good Mix. She expected the report to vanish into the bureaucracy. Instead, within a week, approval arrived for a wartime civilian commendation. But Eddie never received it. The war ended before the paperwork reached Iowa. The award certificate, unsigned and outdated, remained in an army file box for decades. History celebrated the fuel convoys, the Red Ball Express, the great pipelines under the ocean. But the quiet truth endured. In the footnotes of technical reports, the Allied advance in the winter of 1944 to 1945 was sustained in part by a farm-born fuel blend created by a man who never intended to change a war at all. Sometimes, history turns not on generals, but on problem solvers with dirt under their nails. March of 1945 arrived not with triumph, but with exhaustion. Germany was cracked open, but not yet broken. The Rhine, broad, cold, unforgiving, stood as the last great natural barrier between Allied armies and the heart of the Reich. Commanders worried about bridges, pontoons, river currents, artillery cover, and German flak batteries hidden along the eastern bank. But the petroleum officers, they worried about something far simpler distance. The nearer the Allies came to the Rhine, the further their supply lines stretched. Fuel depots in France were now hundreds of miles behind. The Red Ball Express had been disbanded. The winter-ravaged roads strained, under endless convoys of trucks carrying artillery shells, rations, blankets, and above all, gasoline. For the armoured divisions preparing to make the decisive push, fuel was more valuable than ammunition. A tank without shells was still a fortress. A tank without fuel was scrap metal. Major Evelyn Porter, now assigned to the forward logistics group supporting the Ninth Army, watched engineers unload new drums of mixed fuel at a temporary depot in Mönchengladbach. The air smelled of wet earth, exhaust, and oil, an industrial perfume that meant the war machine was still functioning. She leaned over a pump intake, checking viscosity, temperature, and color. The alcohol-extended blend shimmered faintly in the grey light, clearer than standard fuel, sharper, cleaner. The depot chief, Captain Bram Hall, joined her. We're pushing 80,000 gallons a day through here, he said. Half the trucks are asking specifically for the blend. Porter nodded. Any complaints? Hall snorted. Only that we don't have more of it. The tankers say it keeps engines from choking on the low-grade French gasoline we've been forced to mix in. That last part was crucial. As the Allies advanced deeper into Germany, captured fuel dumps once a boon became unpredictable hazards. Some gasoline was decent. Much of it was contaminated. Dirt, water, rust flakes, or worse, mixed with kerosene in desperate German attempts to stretch their own dwindling reserves. Standard American gasoline did not tolerate impurities well. Carburetors clogged. Pumps jammed. Engine knock returned. But the alcohol blend? It burned impurities, stabilized volatile mixtures, and thinned out sludge that would have broken engines weeks earlier. Porter felt a subtle satisfaction. Not pride, just a quiet affirmation that the armies were still moving because the chemistry worked. Across the river, the Germans had reached their breaking point. Fuel shortages had become catastrophic. Whole, armoured brigades sat idle. Trucks were parked for lack of fuel. Aircraft were grounded permanently. Officers walked from position to position because their vehicles could no longer be trusted. Captured diaries from the 1st Parachute Army reflected the despair. We ration fuel by drops now. The Americans drive past with endless supply. How is this possible? The answer lay partly in the enormous industrial output of the United States, but another part lay in the thousands of drums filled with a mixture born in an Iowa barn. When the first Allied patrols reached the Rhine near Remagen on March 7th, the shock was immediate. Germans had failed to destroy the Ludendorff Bridge. It still stood scarred but standing. The race was on. Infantry stormed across. Engineers scrambled to reinforce the structure. Shermans rumbled forward, their engines coughing through the climb up the approach ramp. The bridge groaned under the weight, but held. Then the fuel trucks arrived. Not the big tankers, they were too heavy for the bridge in its battered state. Instead, a swarm of smaller trucks rushed forward, many loaded with the alcohol-extended blend. Drivers leapt out, unloading jerry cans and hand pumps, feeding fuel directly into the armoured spearhead pushing east. Colonel Marcus Boyd, commanding the lead armoured battalion, wrote in his report, "Without immediate fuel resupply, we would have been forced to halt on the far bank. The enemy counterattack would have shattered us before we secured a bridgehead. But they didn't halt. They pushed deeper. A village fell. Then a hill. Then the first crossroads behind the river. Fuel kept them ahead of German artillery adjustments. Fuel kept them alive." Porter watched the reports flow in. She could track success on the map, following the lines of units using the blend. Their advances held. Their breakdowns decreased. Their momentum continued when others stalled. By late March, Allied forces had crossed at multiple points: Remagen, Oppenheim, Wesel. The Rhine, once described as an impossible barrier, now lay behind them. The war entered its final phase. In a German farmhouse near Kassel, a captured logistics officer confessed to a chef interrogator, "We could not understand how your tanks kept moving. Our scouts reported your roads choked with mud, your trucks overloaded. We saw no great depots, no giant fuel trains. Yet your armour advanced 10 miles in a day while ours moved none." When the interrogator asked why he thought this happened, the officer replied, "You have some fuel source we cannot identify. Something that does not freeze, something that burns anything." He was not wrong. At German fuel depots seized intact, chemical officers sniffed drums and frowned. "Smells like whiskey," one remarked. Or corn mash. Porter smiled when she heard the story. In early April, as the Allies closed in on the Ruhr pocket, she received unexpected orders. "Report to General Omar, Bradley's headquarters." Her stomach tightened. High-level summonses rarely meant anything simple. At the command post, Bradley studied her file, tapping one finger on the page listing her fuel blend analysis. "You're the officer who pushed this additive program," he said. "Yes, sir," Porter replied carefully. He closed the folder. "Then you helped keep this army moving through the worst winter in living memory, and you helped us cross the Rhine faster than any planner expected." Porter's throat tightened. "I only followed the data, sir." Bradley smiled faintly. "Sometimes, wars are won by people who follow the data." He reached for a paper. On it was a simple notation. "Recommend commendation for exceptional service in logistical innovation." Porter accepted the document quietly. But as she walked out of headquarters, she found herself thinking of Eddie Markham, the farmer who never knew he had helped build a bridge across the Rhine. History would remember the engineers, the generals, the divisions. But somewhere in the margins, the truth would remain. A river was crossed because engines kept turning. And engines kept turning because one farmer discovered a better way to burn corn. Late April of 1945 settled over central Germany like a tired, thinning fog. The war still rumbled, still killed, still demanded fuel and steel and stamina, but its outcome no longer hung in the balance. Cities had fallen. Armies had shattered. The Luftwaffe existed mostly as smoke on the horizon. Yet the machines of the Allied advance tanks, trucks, bulldozers, Artillery tractors continued to consume fuel at a pace that defied imagination, and still, somehow, they never stopped moving. Captain Joe Kellerman, commanding a maintenance company attached to the 3rd Armored Division, crouched beside a field-expedient fueling point set up outside a devastated German town whose name no longer mattered. Rain pattered against the canvas. Overhead, mud swallowed boots whole. Engines idled in long queues like metallic cattle waiting for their turn at the trough. In the center of it all sat a battered M4 Sherman known as Lucky II, its armor scarred, its paint blistered. The crew sat on the hull, passing around a dented can of cold rations. Their vehicle had fought across France, Belgium, the Ardennes, and now deep inside Germany. It had survived ambushes, mines, rockets, and nearly being buried under a collapsed barn. Yet what brought Lucky II to a halt today was something simpler. Its engine coughed on the last fumes in its tank. Kellerman barked orders to his men. "Get the drums forward. Use the blend high alcohol content. This thing's carburetor is fouled to hell from that junk we took off the German trucks yesterday." His sergeant, a man whose patience had eroded steadily since Normandy, grimaced. "Sir, this blend smells like a barn exploded in the tanker." "Then call it perfume," Kellerman said, "long as it burns." The drums were rolled into position. The fuel shimmered with the faint clarity of something half refined, half raw, but utterly stable. The alcohol cut through impurities. The gasoline carried the heat. The chemistry sang in its own unglamorous key. The tanker operator fitted the hand pump and began pouring life back into the Sherman. Lieutenant Ben Cortlandt, Lucky II's commander, hopped off the hull and approached Kellerman with a grin that looked 20 years older than the man wearing it. "Captain, this stuff really works? Even after what we fed her yesterday?" Kellerman nodded. "It'll get you moving. It got plenty of others moving when nothing else would." Cortlandt chuckled. "Hell, that's all we need." Beyond them, the horizon trembled with thunder, distant artillery, not yet silent. Though German resistance had collapsed into pockets, fighting still flared unpredictably. A Panzerfaust from a single ruined house could still kill a Sherman. A ricochet could still end a life. Victory was near enough to taste, but not near enough to stop the killing. Cortlandt climbed back into the turret. "Fire her up, Danny!" he yelled to his driver. Danny jabbed the starter. The engine turned once, coughed, sputtered, then roared back to life with a throaty growl that sent a wash of exhaust across the fueling point. A cheer rose from nearby tankers. Kellerman wiped rain from his glasses and laughed. "That's the sound of corn doing God's work." Lucky II rumbled forward, joining the column pushing northeast. The crew closed hatches, the turret swung into travel position, and the tank vanished into the misty distance. The fueling point continued its frantic pace. More drums rolled forward. More engines restarted. The war machine kept crawling eastward. What Kellerman did not know, what none of the soldiers fueling up in that muddy field knew, was that German logistics officers were writing their own final, bitter reports. Captured by Allied translators in the weeks that followed, these documents revealed the truth. German armored divisions now received less than 5 gallons of fuel per day, sometimes none at all. Tanks were abandoned with full ammunition racks because there was no fuel to move them. Some crews tried filling engines with lamp oil, wood, alcohol, even animal fats rendered from slaughtered livestock. Engines seized, carburetors choked, exhaust ports clogged into tar. The Reich was out of gasoline, out of alternatives, out of miracles. The Allies were not. They had Eddie Markham's fuel blend, scaled and standardized, carried forward in drums and jerrycans, and tanker trucks that ate up the muddy roads of collapsing Germany. 2 days later, Lucky II and the rest of Cortlandt's company reached a ridgeline overlooking the Harz Mountains. The air was sharp with pine and distant smoke. German resistance in the region had collapsed into disjointed pockets, Volkssturm militia, scattered SS remnants, and desperate groups of soldiers trying to reach the mountains to surrender to the Americans instead of the Soviets. Cortlandt scanned the valley below through his binoculars. "Fuel check, Danny." "3/4 full," the driver replied. "We're good for hours." The crew relaxed. Fuel meant movement. Movement meant survival. A mobile Sherman was a threat. A stationary one was a tomb. At dusk, the battalion's lead elements reached a crossroads where German soldiers emerged waving torn sheets and rags. Dozens surrendered at once, many too exhausted to raise their arms. Their weapons were piled neatly in a ditch. Most carried no food, none carried fuel. An older German sergeant approached Cortland's tank, lifted his empty jerrycan, and muttered in rough English, "Your tanks never stop." Cortland shrugged. "We've got good supply." The German shook his head. "More than good. Impossible." He set the jerrycan down and stepped back. "We lost this war when you built fuel out of corn." Cortland had no answer. The man walked away, joining the other prisoners moving toward the American lines. That night, Cortland wrote in his logbook, "We crossed France on gasoline. We crossed Germany on something stranger. I do not understand the science, but whatever this blend is, it kept us alive when everything else was running dry." By the end of April, the 3rd Armored Division had advanced so far, so quickly, that fuel trucks struggled to keep pace even with the improved blend. Still, the tanks never stopped. They reached the Elbe, then the small towns beyond it, then the shattered outskirts of Magdeburg. Each mile was paid for with gallons that should not have existed, gallons that chemistry and a farmer's stubbornness made real. As May approached, and the Reich neared its final collapse, Lucky 2 rolled into a German village, where white flags hung from every window. The tank's engine idled softly, humming on the same mixture that had pulled it out of the mud in France, through the snows of Belgium, across the frozen roads of the Ardennes, and over the Rhine. The war was ending, and the last tank of April ran on corn.